Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
How's it going, Tristan?
Oh, very, very well. It's another beautiful day here in Cambridge. It happens to be my father's birthday today, his 70th. So a very happy birthday to him.
Oh, happy birthday to Tristan's dad.
He doesn't listen to this podcast, of course, but,
Yes.
a happy birthday nonetheless.
Well, you can at least tell him you wished him a happy birthday on the podcast.
And that's what matters. And we are days away from the Diplomatic Academy here in Cambridge. It is very, very exciting. I'm going to be welcoming all the participants on Sunday. Yeah, so it's a busy, busy week, but a really good, positive week.
Excellent. Well, good luck with all of that. Obviously, I know it's going to be a hectic 2 weeks from here on out for you. A lot of work goes into that. So I'm sure you're excited, anxious, but also a little bit of looking forward to having it be over
Yeah.
at the same time. As much fun as they can be once it's out of the way and everything comes off, you can breathe a sigh of relief.
There's the ability to exhale, momentarily, and then plan for the next one, of course. But nonetheless, it's really rewarding. This is, as you know, what I've been focused on predominantly for the past year. And so to finally have it come to fruition feels great.
Yeah, I'm sure. Big moment. Congrats.
Thanks.
And so we're getting over the heat wave that crushed us last week in the DC area. And I'm coming to you from outside of Akron, Ohio right now. So I'm on a little trip back home to see my dad and my brother. Then I'm back and off and, summer stuff going on. So lots of movement.
Yeah, absolutely.
But anyways, what do we got on the docket today?
Well, first today, we're going to be talking about the United Nations as it turns 80. And then also in international multilateral affairs, we'll get into last week's NATO summit. And then finally, this week, somewhat unusually, we won't be having a guest. Instead, we're going to be tackling the biggest story in the world ourselves, the Israel-Iran conflict that started and thankfully, and certainly at least for now, has ended. So we'll dive into that together.
All right. You mentioned the United Nations hit the ripe old age of 80 on June 26th. And that was the day in 1945 that 50 states at the time signed on to the UN Charter out in San Francisco. And their goal was to create a multilateral institution that would replace and better the failed League of Nations that came into existence after World War I, the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson in the United States, who, as most listeners know, then didn't get it ratified through the U.S. Senate, and the United States didn't join the League of Nations and ended up being a quite toothless organization and didn't do anything to stop the authoritarian rise of fascism and things like that in Europe and in Japan during the 1930s. I will say, though, it did, in one of my classes, I spend quite a bit of time on sort of the idea of international organizations, and we look at the League of Nations and stuff. And it's a lot of people forget, though, that a lot of the institutions and technical organizations and bodies that we know of today that are in the United Nations actually began in the League of Nations. So
Yeah.
it wasn't a complete failure. The major thing that it was meant to do, it failed at, but it did create a number of these organizations and technical bodies that we still use today and are extremely important. So the UN built upon that and then created this body that people thought would stop wars. Obviously, that's not the case. And a lot has changed even since its 75th anniversary back in 2020. We've got obviously Russia invading Ukraine, the Middle East and the Gaza war, and what's been happening with Iran. And a lot of people bemoan the United Nations. A lot of people really like the United Nations for things it's done and given much larger voice to former colonies and smaller nations that aren't the big five and things like that. It does a lot of the important work in development and aid and things like that, like the World Food Program, the UN Development Program. These are massively important organizations. So Tristan, what's your take on this? Why was the UN so important, building upon the things that came before it? But also at the same time, why is the recent anniversary a little bit depressing? And why hasn't the UN lived up to what we expected?
Yeah, I always find in my classes it's very easy to beat up on the UN. And much as you were saying for the League of Nations, we tend to focus, and not without good reason, on its failures, in its shortcomings, to put it mildly. But there is much to celebrate about the UN. Let's really remember the context. The Western world is digging out from the ashes of the Second World War. And the normative idea is to stop interstate war forever. And has it achieved that? No. But that's a pretty ambitious, lofty goal. And it's also important to remember how revolutionary a ambition that is. And we, I think, take for granted somewhat the fact that the idea of offensive warfare to take territory, has been outlawed. And that is a revolutionary and indeed fundamental shift in the way that international affairs works. And the UN has certainly succeeded on that front. Even quite egregious violations of international law are at least discursively shrouded in the idea that it is a defensive move. The idea of territorial conquest, and indeed what used to be the right of states, of sovereign states, to engage in territorial conquest, has been delegitimized. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. And we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, look, for all its shortcomings, particularly when we look back at the composition of the UN Security Council today, it's important to remember that the UN did stop the Cold War from getting hot. And that also is no small achievement, particularly when we think what the history of the latter half of the 20th century was and how perilous things were and how close the USSR and the United States came to a nuclear exchange. That's no small task.
Yeah, and it reminds me of 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Adlai Stevenson, his famous speech at the UN showing the photos of the missiles and things like that, and the back and forth between him and the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations. I mean, at least it gave that forum for them to have this conversation in front of a international audience and people paying attention to that. And I think it's really given a voice at times to the smaller nations, but especially as, like we said, there was 50 originally. How many are there now? I think 189. So we've seen beginning in the 1970s, as the General Assembly has grown, the General Assembly has also given itself a larger voice. Now, it still can only do so much because of the Security Council and things like that, but countries get a bigger voice every now and then with the rotating members of the Security Council and things like that, which really means a lot to these countries that get to do that when their time is come. But also, like we mentioned, the development aid, the peacekeeping missions, for all their faults at times too, there are numbers of times when they have kept the peace and have kept things safer for individuals and ensured food access for people and things like that. What the World Food Program does, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization there, does a lot with food aid and just studying where famines are coming, like what's going to happen next, what we need to do to prepare for this kind of stuff. So these are important technical bodies that aren't in the news, that don't get talked about because it's not Russia, China, and the United States at the Security Council. But it's an extremely important organization, and it'll be interesting to see where things go in the next decade or so, because there is a need for UN reform. And there's a lot of nations that aren't on the Security Council that should be in today's world. There's arguably some countries on the Security Council that shouldn't be in today's world. So how do you reform that? It's easy to say that, oh, India should be on there and other countries like that, or maybe Brazil or Japan. But then what does that mean? And what does Pakistan say about India getting on? What does China say about India getting on? Talking about maybe France shouldn't be on there anymore, or Great Britain. What do they say about that? Obviously, giving up this power is people don't normally do that. And what role does the United States play? It's always been a sort of hard thing to sell to Americans, this idea of, international body that we have to follow. And that's become more of the case in the past couple decades. And you've seen that play out with the Trump administration and them removing themselves from funding and leading different organizations and institutions within the UN. And what does that mean in the long run? We've seen China step in to take over that role in some of these places to gain a lot of the acumen and that sort of soft power within the UN that the US used to have. So we'll see. It's here, it's what we have. And I think for the time being, we've got to make the best use of it that we can.
And I do think that on balance, the UN has made the world a better place over the past 80 years. A perfect place? No. But certainly a better place than would have been the case. And hopefully it's got some life in it yet. Turning now to another multinational body, NATO. Last Tuesday and Wednesday, The Hague hosted the NATO leaders at their annual summit. It is a 32-country alliance, and hanging over NATO right now, even before we get to the question of the war between Russia and Ukraine, is, of course, President Trump, who tends to turn every conversation about NATO into an argument over funding. NATO's founding treaty calls for every member state to spend at least 2% of their GDP, of their gross domestic product, on defense. Admittedly, many states have never actually hit this target, which has caused Trump publicly to cast doubt on America's commitment to Article 5. And it's important to note that President Obama also pushed other NATO members on their spending commitments, but it's certainly fair to say approached it very, very differently than the current American president. And the casting doubt particularly on Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which is really what gives NATO its teeth. And Article 5 is the article that stipulates that an attack on one member of the alliance constitutes an attack on all. So for Article 5 to be denuded of its power, to have any doubt there, really puts us into the position of wondering whether or not NATO is or is headed towards being just a paper tiger, which is obviously not good. Again, we certainly saw exactly what we expected out of the American president at the summit. And look, we can't possibly talk about the summit without talking about what's become the viral moment that came out of the summit when Secretary General Mark Rutte referred to Trump as daddy in reference to his efforts to get Iran and Israel to a ceasefire. And look, let's park, to the extent we can, the psychology at play there. The point is, at the very least, it was a very strange moment, but it does show, I think, and this is what's important about this moment, it does show that the Europeans have figured out how to play to the particular psychology of the American president. And we saw this not just in a lot of the language that the Europeans were using that seemed to be just way too deferential, but we also saw it in the very way that the Secretary General organized the summit. He kept it as short as possible, knowing that the American president isn't known for having an attention span, and when abroad wants to get back home as quickly as possible. And we see that. They've figured him out. And I think this is a good thing, not just for the NATO alliance, but for international relations with the American government writ large. So that's an extended preface to NATO and to particularly the issues on the NATO agenda at the moment. But Kelly, how did things shake out last week? Did the summit actually achieve anything apart from that central issue of funding?
Yeah, so I think you provided a good background here on this and the craziness of the NATO-Trump relationship in his first administration was just that. And us folks in international affairs, it was so frustrating in his first term when he would say that, like, NATO countries, they owe us this money. And like people in the US are like, they owe us money. They don't owe us money. It's their own money that they're not putting into their defense and things like that. So to your point, not only did Obama try to get them to increase spending, but this is something that's gone back to 1949. This is not a new issue of the Europeans not doing as much as the US and not necessarily paying their way to the same extent. And things like that come to be demonstrated when, like in the case of the Libya incursion in 2011, the US wanted to step back and let the other NATO countries lead, but they couldn't do it without the US and their weaponry, air refueling, the intel, all of these sort of things. So it demonstrated that NATO isn't NATO when the United States doesn't take the leading role. But still, then it took them a while. For all that being said, this summit did go a long way to doing the things that NATO needs to do. And I think it's not the outcome you would have expected given Trump's first term, and especially given what Vice President Vance said when he was in Europe a couple months ago, what Secretary Hegseth said when he was there. It wasn't all that reassuring for NATO allies, the way they spoke about NATO and like the US being involved in different areas and different things. So I think part of this is due to that daddy moment. I think for all of the sort of craziness and sheer strangeness of the Secretary General of NATO calling him that, I think there is something to that. The fact that he's coming directly from bombing Iran and then getting a ceasefire, like 2 days later, he goes to the NATO summit. He's riding high. And I think that's where you want Trump to be. He feels, that I think that he can do certain things and be magnanimous a little bit and things like that. And I think the Europeans and the NATO countries played into that. They were also already talking about this 5%, in this increase to 3.5%, and then another 1.5% being spent on infrastructure that's related to military needs and things like that. So they had already set the stage for this to be a successful summit. And like you said, they're keeping it short. He could have left 5 hours into the summit, and even then he's not really leaving early, right? So I think those things came together to make this arguably, well, maybe not even arguably, the best NATO summit during a Trump presidency. He's not shoving other heads of state out of the way. He's not leaving early. He made some more positive comments about Article 5 and the United States upholding that, which will make the Europeans or the NATO allies feel much better, obviously. So we'll see what happens moving forward. Obviously, Trump will like this because it's numbers that he can sell that to the domestic audience. It shows that he got them to do this. Now, keep in mind, it's not just Trump, right? The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was the real driver of the NATO allies increasing defense spending, because especially right after a Trump administration staring down the barrel of the possibility of another Trump administration, they realized we can't necessarily guarantee ourselves the backing of the United States. So we are going to have to increase defense spending and do more, because this is a revanchist Russia on our doorstep. So that, coupled with what Trump is pushing, got them moving in the direction they needed to move. But there's also some caveats to this, right? There's a timeline involved in this. Like, how long is that timeline for them? There's been mention of 2035. So it gives them a whole decade to increase this defense spending, which that's still good, but you kind of need this stuff a little bit faster. And then there's also questions over the 1.5 increase in infrastructure spending. What constitutes infrastructure? That's a big question too. So we'll see.
Yeah, indeed. That was actually what I really picked up on just after the summit. I was looking at the announcement that the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, made, and he seems to be roping a lot of domestic Canadian infrastructure spending into somehow counting towards defense spending. Now, admittedly, I haven't looked into it beyond that first glance level, but that's an amazing sell if you can get away with it.
Right. And the Italians are doing the same thing. Giorgia Meloni's building a bridge that, it's not quite the bridge to nowhere, but it's going to be a hard sell to show how that's part of the defense infrastructure of Italy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But again, positive things. And I think, like you mentioned, I think it's important to note too that the Europeans seem to have, you never know. You can never say somebody figured out Donald Trump, but they seem to be doing the right things for the moment. And it goes to show too, look at the 2 or 3 people that had the least contentious Oval Office visits recently. It was Starmer, it was Mertz, and it was Carney. I mean, there were moments, but it wasn't South Africa, it wasn't Ukraine. So they've kind of got an idea now on how to approach Donald Trump. So we'll see what that means for NATO moving forward. But again, this is a positive moment, and they walked away without Trump leaving early, without him shoving somebody out of the way, and with him somewhat more openly backing Article 5. So these are all wins in a NATO Trump world.
Exactly. And we'll take the wins where we can.
So moving into our last story of the week, and this is going to be covering the big one that everybody's been talking about for the past few weeks. And that's the Iran-Israel war that started. And for now, at least a ceasefire is holding between the two countries. And obviously, the United States openly attacked Iran and dropped bunker buster bombs on Fordo, the underground nuclear facility in Iran, and also attacked Isfahan and Natanz, which are other Iranian nuclear sites. And remains to be seen what the actual damage done to the underground facility was. President Trump is saying that it was completely obliterated. The Defense Intelligence Agency came out just a couple days after the bombing and said that it may have only set it back a couple months. There's reporting now that's saying that the United States has intercepted phone calls of Iranians that are talking about how the US bombs didn't cause as much damage as they expected. As a former intel analyst myself, it horrifies me that that has been released because of the sources and methods that that's giving away. And the Iranians are now definitely going to tighten up their comms on that kind of stuff. So I don't like to see leaks like that. So that remains to be seen what damage was done. But there's a ceasefire holding for now. The Iranians fired missiles back at the United States in a highly telegraphed situation where they didn't want things to escalate. So they basically forewarned, launched the same amount of missiles as bombs that we dropped and on Fordo. And then the Trump administration thankfully did not respond to that and recognized it for what it was and gave the opportunity for both sides to declare victory, which they've done. And now the ceasefire seems to be holding. And President Trump pressured Netanyahu to not retaliate to Iranian bombings just before or maybe right after the ceasefire happened. So we'll see what happens from here. The US side is saying that they're going to start talks again. The Iranians haven't really said that. But there's a moment here and there's an open question on what happens. Are the Iranians going to negotiate? And are they going to move in the direction that the Trump administration and Israel wants them to move? Because we'll get into that because on the one hand, this may show them we need a nuclear weapon. So this doesn't happen.
Yeah.
On the other side of this, it's demonstrated their weakness. So maybe it will make them come to the table. So that all remains to be seen. But Tristan, what's your view of this over the last couple of weeks? And a lot has happened within that week and the dust is settling at the moment. But where do you see us going from here?
Well, certainly where I hope we're going from here is back to a period where missiles aren't being lobbed across borders or just being lobbed at all.
Yeah, that's a good place to get to. Yeah.
This is generally the direction of travel I will always want to see us going in. But indeed, the big question is whether or not this will hold. And I do think that you really pinpoint what's really struck me is the extent to which it appears that Iran has been shown to be weak, weaker than they certainly projected themselves as being, and certainly weaker than I really recognized they had been made to be as a result of Israeli strikes, not just directly at Iran, but thinking of Hezbollah and thinking of the Houthis as well. It seems that Iran's ability to deter has effectively been, is it too far reaching to say, wiped out?
Yeah, and Freddie and I actually wrote about this last week in our online magazine, The Diplomatic Pouch. It really has put on stark display the degradation of the things that Iran has had in the past to use as a deterrent to attack. And I think this is part of the way that Netanyahu and maybe some of the hawks within or Iran hawks within the Trump administration sold this to President Trump was that, look, you have a window here to attack Iran that we have never had before. With the degradation of Hamas, the degradation, not to quite the same extent, but Hezbollah has been really hit hard in Lebanon. They're also like hanging on to their political life in Lebanon. So they're not what they were. You've lost Assad in Syria. So there's not that base of operations that Iran used to have. And then you have the Israelis who took out their air defenses and demonstrated that they had, to a large extent, control of the air in Iran, you're not really going to have that window all the time. And that's not a window we've ever had as far as being able to attack Iran and not worry in the same way that Hamas and Hezbollah were going to hit Israel or hit American forces in the region. You also have the fact that Iran only has so many of these ballistic missiles, and them lobbing them at Israel over the course of that first week drew down the numbers that they had and also demonstrated that they're only about a 10% effective rate. And the rest of them are getting shot down. You don't want any of them to be effective, but that's not very good efficiency for these missiles. So it was a opportune moment. Did I want the US to bomb Iran? No, but like I can see how the situation could be presented to President Trump to have him go through with that bombing. But I think to your point, the overall weakness of Iran that we now see, I think, is one of the most surprising aspects of this. And moving to if we have negotiations, how do you think that plays into the calculus on both sides?
Well, yeah, it is this weakness, this exposed weakness that I think actually really complicates the negotiation. The American president mused about the idea of regime change, and that's particularly dangerous when the question of nuclear weapons is on the table. That incentivizes. What we do know about nuclear weapons is that if you want to guarantee regime security, get yourself some nukes, right? That is one of the driving imperatives behind North Korea getting the bomb.
And on the flip side, give them up like Libya, and you end up like Gaddafi.
Indeed. And so the historical record tells us, actually, I think, a quite clear story. And so that worries me. But we're hearing lines from all relevant parties about possible talks. Iran has stated unequivocally that America must rule out any more strikes on Iran if it wants to resume nuclear talks, and that Iran insists on its right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes, for domestic energy generation, which seems to certainly to be at odds with the Israeli and I believe the American positions.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a harder sell, like you said, especially for the Trump administration now, because there's a lot of Iran hawks that lean towards that Israeli position. And Trump, after bombing them, he's going to want a seemingly tougher deal. But at the same time, President Trump has shown his ability to sell just about anything to his base and his followers and to the Republican Party. So we'll see what happens with that. We laugh about it to some extent, but it's almost like we should not have pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal that the Obama administration signed in 2015 and decided that we didn't like it because it was our predecessor's deal and President Trump wanted to get something better. So I do think it's going to be difficult moving forward, but I think, like you mentioned at the opening, not lobbing missiles is better than dropping bombs and lobbing missiles. So let's get back to talks. Let's see where we can go from here and try to get something done.
Absolutely.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.